Дякую вам за запрошення. Це для мене велика честь. І я говорив трохи з доктором Зарицьким, і про що я повинен говорити, і він казав, що я буду принаймні говорити про сучасні речі, спеціально що діється в Східній Україні, і humanitarian situation, і також short-term and long-term solutions. So, thank you again to the organizers for having me here. It's a great honor. This actual appearance, if you want to call it that, kicks off quite a maniacal series of speaking and moderating engagements up ahead. Some of us will be next weekend at the Halifax Security Forum, and then I'm going back to Ukraine. I was just there for the Lviv Security Forum. See you there, Oksana. Also, Kyiv Post Tiger Conference and America House. In case she has to leave earlier, I just wanted to acknowledge the presence of a former colleague from UNICEF, Jessica Adak, who is the International Program Coordinator for UNICEF Canada. So at the end, I'll be talking about short and long-term solutions. So UNICEF, it's not only because I've worked with them before, but they've proven to be a very, very big supporter of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Now, just before, we're going to try and play a quick video, but I just wanted to give you some breaking news from Twitter, because RT was brought up, and I checked it out, and it isn't fake news. Russia State TV is reporting that RT's corporate U.S. shell, which is called TNR Productions LLC, is facing a final deadline to register as a foreign agent in the United States. Otherwise, its bank accounts may be frozen, and its figurehead, Mikhail Solodivnikov, risks being arrested. So,
wow.
There we are. Remember where you heard that first. Now, let's see if this... I've got a very brief part of a video that we did on CNN Amber. It was a year ago. I don't know if we have audio.
Let's move on to the battlefield now. The ceasefire agreement signed in Minsk, more than a year ago now, reducing the violence, but far from ending it. How much of an uptick has there been of late, and how serious?
Well, Michael, since the beginning of April, it's gotten to very, very critical stages. There's been a big escalation going on. Earlier in the month, there was 1 week where the OSCE recorded the most number of explosions in 1 week ever. And that included a 30-minute period where there are about 10 explosions per minute. That's a lot. On top of that, Michael, heavy weaponry has returned. And we're talking also about multiple rocket launch systems, which are very, very damaging. And also, I know we've talked in the past about Grad missiles, basically stupid weaponry, which are not guided, but typically land in residential neighborhoods and cause a lot of damage. Also, over the past few days, very worrisome, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine has been targeted by live fire. No one really knows the end game right now of the rebel side, but the fact that more heavier weaponry is put back into place and being used is very worrisome.
And indeed it is. And Michael, all of this points to a failure of diplomacy, surely, especially when such violations bring pretty much no repercussions for the violator.
You know, Michael, the thing that one sees right now is the rebel side being able to resupply itself without interruption. Clearly, you know, this heavy weaponry is not coming from the local hardware store. It's coming from somewhere. And on top of that, Michael, what we're seeing also is new faces in the rebel side. And also, there's no way that internally they could have done things like introduced new curriculum, the Russian ruble, imported Russian goods. So there is a massive coordination of what's happening in rebel-held territories going on. But very worrisome what we're seeing on a number of fronts.
And you being diplomatic, the Ukrainians would say it's coming from Russia, of course, and have said as much as well. You know, because of all this fighting, the humanitarian situation worsens. We said at the beginning, the World Food Programme estimating the conflict has left 1.5 million people hungry, 300,000 in need of immediate help. And it is always the people caught in the middle who are forgotten when it comes to conflicts like this. How bad is it?
It's very bad, and it continues to get worse. You know, by now, Michael, a lot of the internally displaced people in Ukraine from Donetsk and Luhansk, we're talking about 2 million, would have expected to go back. There was a very nice lull over, you know, the holidays, but that now has stopped. Michael, 2 years ago, there was no World Food Program in Ukraine, as you pointed out, and 2 years ago, Ukraine had no displaced population. Now it's on the list of top 10 countries in the world with the largest displaced population. So it's a very big drag on the government resources and on people's lives, and especially children who have lost their parents, who have psychosocial trauma, who don't have essential drugs, food, and water. It's a very horrible situation, and very, very bad if the international community averted its gaze from this situation.
Basically, I'm talking to Michael Holmes, who's sitting in for Christian Amanpour, about the security situation in the East and about the humanitarian situation. And for all Donald Trump has said about CNN being fake news, they do deserve a lot of credit, especially CNN International, for constantly highlighting the Ukraine situation when a lot of other broadcasters have basically forgotten what's going on in eastern Ukraine. So I do approach them quite often. They're always asking for an update, and as much as possible, they try to get either me or somebody else on to inform the world of what's going on. Now, just a little bit about the current security situation in eastern Ukraine. Sad to say that after a relative lull in hostilities, the violence has escalated yet once again along the 459-kilometer contact line. And what is happening now, in fact, it's hard to believe we're at 4 years now, is it's basically morphed into a kind of low-intensity conflict with spikes in violence from time to time. And the main problem right now, of course, is that there's a very big concentration of heavy weaponry, including tanks and multiple rocket launch systems in very close proximity to each other. So typically what happens, one side will fire, the other side retaliates. Problem being is that most of these Grad missiles and other weaponry land in very densely populated urban areas, hence the very high casualties. A key flashpoint at the moment is that it's getting plenty of attention is the area around the Donetsk water filtration plant. There's been renewed shelling there in the past week, and the area right around the plant has been was hit 3 consecutive nights recently. And then we also have the Verkhno-Kolomoisky filtration plant, and that was hit in the past week 12 times on a single night. Why is this important? Well, a direct hit on either of these plants could cause the release of deadly chlorine gas from one of the 900-kilogram containers stored at these plants. And of course, the release means that anyone within a 200-meter radius could receive a deadly dose of that gas. So the other thing, of course, is that if these plants are put out of action, up to actually more than 350,000 people could be cut off from crucial water supplies. And don't forget, in most of Ukraine, the heating comes from water as well, and winter has now taken hold in that part of the country, so it could be very disastrous. Neil Walker, the UN Humanitarian Coordinator in Ukraine, has warned of, quote, grave consequences, unquote, for millions of Ukrainians. It warns that up to 1.1 million Ukrainians on both sides of the contact line risk losing water. And of course, both sides need to be reminded that any intentional disruption of quality water supply and critical heating is a violation of international humanitarian law. Now, in terms of what I described happening with this conflict, low intensity, spiking, we have periods of peace, we have spikes, is that, in my opinion, and believe me, I was not able to say this as spokesperson for the OSCE, so I'm giving you a bit of value added, is that it does look like it's become a tool for the Putin regime to literally turn up the heat on Ukraine, to put pressure when they think it's required and to let them off when it's not. So it's very interesting to see how this kind of conflict is synchronized with what's going on politically in Ukraine. Now, we have the situation in the East, but it's also important to note we've seen quite clearly recently is that the conflict is not just limited to the east anymore. A spike in targeted assassinations in Kyiv and explosions at arm depots has caused a destabilization outside of the east of the country. And among other things causing deaths, it's also, I believe, a deterrent to foreign investment. And for the most part, Ukrainian law enforcement has been either unwilling or unable to solve many of these crimes, including the car bombing of journalist Paul Shutermet last year near the Kyiv Opera House in broad daylight. That crime remains unsolved, and in fact, some enterprising journalists in Ukraine have come up with very crucial evidence which law enforcement somehow was not able to find. So there you go, another plug for us supporting and investing in investigative journalism. Onto the humanitarian situation. So as another winter sets in, there's a lot of concern at the moment about people's coping mechanisms. I think the statistics are pretty familiar to most of you, more than 10,000 dead and over 22,000 injured. And by the way, that 10,000 dead includes the 298 victims of MH17. Relatives that plane recently observed the third anniversary of the downing of that plane in Amsterdam. According to the UN, 3 to 4 million people in Ukraine are in need of humanitarian aid and protection after 4 years of this conflict. 70% of those vulnerable are the elderly, women, and children. I think we can, we'll just play a quick video from the UN if we can get audio.
Совершенно без отопления, без угля. И никто обещались как будто в поддержку, и поддержки нет. Ну, так как много детей, больных, очень сложно.
Вы представьте себе, она начала бахать, а я, сын пришел, а я на земле лежу. Мама, ты лежишь? Чашка стоит, а ты вот лежишь на земле, я смотрю тебя. Не добейся ничего. Вызвали скорую, везли. Мы не хотим войны, мы хотим, чтобы все хорошо было. Чтобы мир был на земле.
It is a humanitarian crisis, and I stand with you and want to share with the people that they are not forgotten by the international community.
And by the way, I've traveled many times into the occupied areas along the contact line on the Ukrainian side. I've talked to displaced people in Kyiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Mariupol, and that's the one thing you hear. We want to go home, we want peace. We don't want to live outside of our homes in other parts of Ukraine, but we want to go home. But at the moment, that's impossible for a lot of people. So hence, because of the situation in the occupied areas, a lot of people have to cross to get money, to get their pensions, to get groceries, this sort of thing. The problem, of course, is that when they do cross, they're forced to wait hours, sometimes 24 hours, for permission to cross. There's also the threat of shelling, and there's also the growing threat of landmines as well. UNICEF estimates that over 200,000 boys and girls, 200,000, live within 15 kilometers of each side of the contact line where most of the violence is happening. And about 2% of that number are regularly forced to take refuge in improvised bomb shelters. And by bomb shelters, we've seen them with our own eyes in the OSCE, basements, unheated basements, dugouts, you name it. It's very grim conditions. Also, according to UNICEF, one school in five in non-government controlled areas has been damaged and are in urgent need of repair. Sadly, getting a better grasp on the situation in the occupied areas has become more difficult recently because I met with foreign journalists in Kiev when I was there 2 weeks ago, and they're all saying that they're effectively banned from traveling to Donetsk and Luhansk. Can no longer go there and do the critical reporting that they once did. Thankfully, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission is there in very, very big numbers, but it's really important for foreign journalists to have access as well. And by the way, even if they were to get in, there's also another inhibition, a very real one, and that is once they get out, it's very likely that they'll be posted, their names and details will be posted on an online site that effectively describes foreign journalists as traitors because they went into there to report what's going on. Now, what are the prospects for peace at the moment? I'm usually an optimist, those of you who know me, and I have to salute the very, very hard work of the OSCE leadership, Ambassador Apakan, my former boss, the Swiss, the Germans, the Austrians have all tried very, very hard to get a long-lasting peace agreement, the last of which was September. They tried to put together a ceasefire at the beginning of the school year. It hardly lasted one day. As you know, most of you know that the Minsk agreement, some say, is not even worth the paper it's on. And the good news, though, I think, from my own perspective, is I think we're getting clearer messages outside of the Trump administration as to the situation in Ukraine. At the beginning, there was quite a bit of worry about mixed signals, but I think they've cleaned up their act a bit there. And hopefully that will translate into more peace dividends for Ukraine. Before I conclude with what I think we can do in the short and long term, and I may be speaking a little bit off script or off message here, but since the UN peacekeeping mission was brought up, it behooves me to say a few words, and I have spoken to many people in Ukraine about this, including government officials, diplomats, people here, and I have to be very candid with you, is that I haven't seen a fully developed strategy for this UN peacekeeping mission. I think that if it were to happen, we risk wasting of resources and, very importantly, more deaths. And bear in mind that just recently, very sadly, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, after 3 years in Ukraine, had its first fatality, an American monitor, and also injuries too. Now, of course, a UN peacekeeping mission will depend on the Security Council vote, and I have my doubts as to whether Russia will support this unless it's done completely on their own terms. The other thing to remember for a UN peacekeeping mission is that the ramp-up time will probably be very long. They wouldn't be familiar with the territory or with key interlocutors the way the OSCE is. And again, the OSCE mission has been doing what it can under very, very difficult circumstances. They've been recording not only what's going on from day to day, but also I think they've been acting in a deterrent in many ways. And also they've been very involved in temporary ceasefires and also the facilitation of crucial repair work to infrastructure like water, like gas pipes. And I think that a UN mission, as I indicated earlier, would probably be very much manipulated by Russia. Now, the conservative leader, I'm so unfamiliar with him, but I think his name is Andrew Scheer, and others want the UN mission to be on the Russian-Ukrainian border. I doubt very much, given our experience in the OSCE, that the Russians will allow that. Every day, at least a few times a day, the OSCE monitors, again under a lot of difficult circumstances, do try and approach the Russian border, 475 kilometers more or less, and they're normally turned back. So there we go. Just quickly, in terms of what we can do, some takeaways for you. Well, I think in the short term, we can, as a community, support the humanitarian agencies that are very active in the region, including the ICRC, UNICEF, World Food Program, Save the Children. And by the way, speaking of World Food Program, Ukraine, for the past 2 years or so, has been the only country in Europe receiving food aid. And the World Food Program, they're rock stars in my opinion in terms of their ability to deliver food almost anywhere in the world, have been saving the lives literally of a lot of our fellow Ukrainians along the contact line. Unfortunately, the so-called LNR and DNR do not provide unfettered access for humanitarian agencies, but they do try to get away with what they can. This is also, I think, very, very important for you to remember is that currently the 2017 Humanitarian Response Plan for Ukraine is severely underfunded. Only 20% is funded. They still require $147 million to meet the humanitarian needs in eastern Ukraine. And in the case of UNICEF, as of 30th of June of this year, UNICEF had received only 38% of the 31 million they require. And on the diplomatic side, as a community, we enjoy very good relationships with key government officials in both Ottawa and Washington. It's very important, of course, to put pressure on them to remain actively engaged in Ukraine and search for a peaceful solution, and to uphold the sanctions or even strengthen them on Russia. I believe Mr. Chole said earlier that he thinks that sanctions should extend to SWIFT and other kind of channels where money is routinely moved. I agree with that, and I've always said that if the Diaspora goes to Miami to Bal Harbor Mall and tries to use her Amex Gold or Black Card and it doesn't work, believe me, that Diaspora will call her sugar daddy in Moscow. Sugar daddy will call Putin and say, what is going on? So you may want to think about that. And then just quickly on the long term, I think that we do need to start a discussion, whatever will happen one way or another in Donbass, on the future of Donbass, the fate of the 2 million displaced Ukrainians, many of whom are going to their fourth year of displacement. Rehabilitation of the region will cost billions of dollars, including a demining effort. But roads, bridges, critical infrastructure, hospitals, schools require a lot of repairs. And I also think that Ukraine and also the Ukrainian community would be sending out a very important message if it became more involved in humanitarian relief elsewhere in the world as well. Remember that in Ukraine we have an incredible human resource base of doctors, medical professionals, lawyers, and so on. They should be deployed as well from time to time to crisis areas. I think it would send a very good message for Ukraine. And also, it's very, very important, I firmly believe this, that the Ukrainian World Congress and other diaspora organizations speak out against grave violations of human rights happening elsewhere in the world, whether on the horrendous Saudi-led blockade of Yemen, which could trigger a famine that could claim millions of lives, to the genocide occurring before our eyes in South Sudan, to the Assad regime's deadly use of chemical weapons against innocent civilians, including children. Remember that in this highly interconnected world that we live in, the creation of yet another failed state can have reverberations for years to come. And finally, one thing I would like to see, we have the kind of, it's interesting, the same problem of the Israelis. I did the numbers. We have very few of our own people in the UN. I can probably count on one hand the number of Ukrainians that I know from the diaspora, from Ukraine itself, who work at agencies like UNICEF, like WFP. We need to get more Ukrainians in there. Just very quick anecdote, I worked for several months in Geneva as global spokesperson for UNICEF. And twice a week at the Palais des Nations, I had to identify crises around the world that deserved attention. And that gave me the opportunity from time to time to raise the situation in Ukraine before a world audience. So we need more people in those key positions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that, both not only relevant information, but also emotional information.